So, if you're watching this video, you're about to watch me recite what happened in court. And I've thought long and hard around how to go about this video, if I should talk about it in themes, if I should be exact. And the way that I've decided to do it is to be as accurate as possible with what happened and what was said, what questions that I can remember being asked in cross-examination. And I'm trying to make it as lifelike to day, real time of what happened on day one, day two, day three, and day four. But I want to put out a couple of disclaimers. Firstly, there may have been things that happened in court that were legally obligated to happen that way, or legally strategic, or due to something that I'm unaware of because I'm not legally trained. I'm very aware of that, but it isn't really my job to explain anything legally. All I can do is recite what happened of my own personal subjective experience. So therefore, everything that I'm going to share is what I saw and what I remember happening, how I remember it happening, my interpretation of that thing happening, and then as a consequence, how I was left feeling about it. Another thing is if somebody's watching this that they're about to go to court as well, I'm not by any stretch of the imagination trying to say that this will be everybody's experience. It might give a flavour to some people that are heading into court, but I'm not saying that everybody will have the same experience as me. And one of the reasons why I'm making these videos is because there was such a stark difference between what happened in trial one versus what happened in trial two. And I think that's quite telling regarding the look of the drawer of what happens on the day, which is led by the CPS. It was a very difficult period and a very difficult few days. And as and when I get talking about that, I'm at risk of maybe speaking a bit more quickly when I get a bit more animated or whatever. If that happens, then forgive me if my speed of speech gets a bit faster. Just slow down the speed on YouTube to 0.95 or something, and then you can possibly hear me a bit better. So the morning of trial two, this time we were in a different court. It was a much more modern court, which meant that the court was smaller. Now, if you haven't watched my other videos on what it's like to be in court, then it's worthy of you taking a little bit of time to watch those because I've made a longer detail on this. But even on the entrance into the court, I ended up coming face to face within a metre of this man that I was prosecuting, and he was there with one other person as well. And I came face to face with them, staring at them over a table hours before I was going on stand, which was quite anxiety inducing to say the least. I think it's fair to say that none of us were smiling at one another, but the fact that we'd all been told to be there at the same time, same door, same time, I mean, it's just yet another admin horrendous thing from the CPS that should not be happening. I wanted to be taken around the side door again like had happened on trial one, but to our knowledge there wasn't a side door, so we all had to go through the main door. We'd all been told to meet at the same time. And this happens throughout the whole week, I'll just say in advance. We're all going into the same court together. There's these long corridors in quite a modern building this time. But be prepared that if you are going on stand, or even if you're going behind a curtain and you want to sit with your family through the trial, be prepared that you are going to bump into the person that abused you several times a day, in the corridor, around town, in the canteen, you name it. Like, they're not separated at all. So you're basically sharing this space with the person that did this. So it's just something to be mindful of. So it was day one. I met the police. Obviously, we came in. Had that incident on the metal detectors when I came face to face with this guy. I then went into a back room again. My brother came over this time, and we just sat there and had a chat, which it was great that we could do that. Then my brother was asked to leave. He went and then joined the rest of my family, and I stayed with the police. They showed me a model again. There was another volunteer there again, and the court was very different. It was much more modern. Another thing to be mindful of in the modern court of a Crown Court these days, it was a separated gallery. So there was a left and a right and an aisle in the middle. So anybody supporting me and anybody supporting him would sit quite far away from each other. But there's only one gallery seating area, by memory about 20 seats in total. So we're all sitting together. That means anybody there to support me and anybody there to support him. So there was one person there with him and there was people there with me. But it's just uncomfortable when you're literally sat a metre or two away from somebody that is supporting the opposing team, shall we say. But I categorically knew on this one, there was no way that barrister was not speaking to me before I was going on stand, not with what happened last time. I had so many questions. I wanted to know he had my evidence. I wanted to know he knew the detail. I was prepared for everything. I didn't know if he'd received this summarised document that I'd created. But anyway, The barrister came in and he this time actively sought me down. He wanted to speak to me, so it was already very, very different. He was a youngish guy, and as soon as he opened his mouth, I thought, bloody hell, I am in safe hands here. This guy had done his research, he had his file with him. And my very first question to him was, do you have my evidence? And he just picked up this wad of papers and he kind of fanned them with his hand, and it was all the pictures, and he printed them out. As well, actually, I've got some questions for you. I couldn't believe he had questions for me. He had the detail and he wanted to know more about the detail. And one of his first questions was how comfortable I was to talk through all these pictures. And I was like, absolutely. I know them all inside and out. So that's absolutely fine. He wanted to know how comfortable I was being asked this and that. And it was brilliant. He knew my witnesses' names. It wasn't just witness one and witness two. He knew them by the first name. And he was just so on the ball. And I cannot tell you how relieved I felt. And he was very patient with me as well, because I had a whole bunch of things I'd written down to double check that he knew enough detail this time. I was like, he wasn't leaving that room until I knew that he knew everything that he needed to know, given that I wasn't going to be able to ever get a jury again. He also made it very clear to me, and this is the part that I thought was quite tricky. He said he needed to absolutely stress that everything that was said in the hung jury was completely redundant. You know, it was not going to be used in this trial whatsoever. And the judge had made that very, very clear. So if there was any reference whatsoever of the hung jury and anything he said in the hung jury, the judge would cancel this court case, and the chance of us being given a third court case would be next to zero. So he couldn't stress enough the importance of not doing that. So I really remember concentrating. I can't say anything about the last trial, because I mean, what that basically meant is the guy that we were prosecuting could go out and completely rewrite a completely new narrative and make a load of stuff up again, and it wouldn't have any consequences of the fact that that was different from the first court case. But nonetheless, I just had to take the rules as I was given them. And when the barrister left, I remember thinking it was possibly the first time somebody had spoken to me from the CPS that actually left me feeling like I had any bloody value to offer in this whole process whatsoever. You know, I was the one that knew the detail. I was the one that this happened to. And in the first trial, I just honestly felt like I was just a lump of evidence. I wasn't anybody that knew enough that could help out the actual case. I was just a lump of evidence and wasn't even spoken to. Anyway, I remember when he left, the police said, "Oh, you happy?" He was seemed good. And I was like, happy? He's absolutely bloody brilliant. I remember literally doing that. Thank you, universe. So I thought I was in really, really safe hands. I had asked questions around the guy that I was prosecuting, what his barrister was like. And I had been informed from another guy that was absolutely brilliant on the organisation of the actual court and people being in the right places at the right time. And he did say to me, I'm going to be honest with you, he's a very, very well-respected barrister. He's got a very good reputation. Now I'd met my barrister, I thought, well, it's anybody's day now. It's like both of us are going out there with very strong barristers. But I knew that he had the evidence. I knew he knew the detail. And I knew that the lies weren't going to wash with this person because he knew the detail so well. I don't know how long he'd had to go over my case. I asked him if he'd received the summarised document that I created, and he looked at me blankly like he hadn't. So to this day, I don't think he'd read it, but it didn't really matter. It was clear that he knew enough to go out there and put a good prosecution case together. So it's a very similar drill to last time. I waited in the back room and Usher came to get me. I went up on stand, and this time I was on stand. It's hard to say exactly, but I'm probably going to guess about 45 minutes. So I felt it was fair this time. And I got a chance to finally speak. I got given all the pictures. I got asked to go through them, talk my way through them. They're looking for fluidity of talking, being able to recite other people's names and then what the context was. I then got to share how we got together and like just so many things that actually came up in my video interview I was asked about, and I could recite and answer questions on them. And it was a really bloody good examination. I was so happy with this barrister. He was just so good. And then I got cross-examined. And I think, again, this is all down to my own interpretation. We had a very obviously strong case, but what really threw me is that the first thing that the cross-examiner said to me when I was on stand in the second trial was, what did he put his hands up like this and said, we don't, oh yeah, he said something like, we concede everything that you've said to date. So basically, firstly, what was then happening is that this guy that I'd been prosecuting for the last 6 years now at this point had categorically denied everything. And in this moment, he was now admitting everything that I'd said, but just denying the rape. So that had changed on the morning of trial two, which threw me. And I thought, I want to say, well, hold on a minute, I don't get it, but I just had to kind of roll with it. And then the cross-examination barrister was very respectful. The videos weren't used, by the way, it was only the pictures that were used. And my barrister, I did ask him about it, and he said, I don't think we need them because we've got so much with the pictures. The cross-examination probably lasted about 10 minutes. The barrister didn't try any dirty hand tactics with trick questions or try and make up some fabricated cheating story 2 years later. And one of the things that I absolutely loved about this trial was the judge. He was absolutely brilliant. The only things that are going to happen in his court were the truth and respect. And anything that wasn't those things, there was going to be consequences for them. And I found out afterwards that the judge had actually had a word with the guy that were prosecuting, because he tried the act again of sitting there in the dock and shaking his head at me, and the judge clamped down on it immediately. He only let him do it once, and he gave him a very, very stern warning because it wasn't respectful behaviour. So anything that was outside what he would term as respectful, and this went for all our family as well, and me obviously, and anything from either side, it was categorically the truth or respect. And he had very little tolerance for anything else. And he had so much control over this court, and it was just brilliant. And when I looked at the jury, it was a completely different group of people. You couldn't have got a more diverse group of people. There were 6 men, 6 women. And for a start, I didn't have anybody sat there scowling at me like I did in trial one. I was spoken to very respectfully from both barristers. The judge was absolutely ace. I thought it was amazing. But I had a chance to speak. My barrister knew I wanted to speak. He had full intentions of allowing me to share the truth and share my experience of what happened in all these different stories that were now coming out. And then that was pretty much the end of my time on stand. I then left and met up with my family afterwards, had a chat with the barrister afterwards as well. So he spoke to me before and after, but he was always very, very patient and very willing to answer questions or have a conversation with me. And it changed the whole experience a lot. And this guy was right on the ball. I mean, he was so sharp. So that was the end of day one, really. We didn't find day one as traumatic as we did in the first trial. So we weren't exactly excited about it, because you can never tell which way the cookie crumbles on these situations. But we felt a lot better after day one, myself and my family, than we did on trial one. Then it came to day two, and on this day there was only going to be 2 of my witnesses. So basically, witness number 1 was the lady on the video link again. The IT worked well. And then finally, the situation in Circus Circus, the whole evening was talked about, and my witness had a chance to answer questions over it and explained the context of what had happened on the build-up and who was there and what happened at the time, and then what happened afterwards. So eventually we actually had some context which now got shared on stand. So the jury heard the full story, which was brilliant to hear. And my witness was really assertive about it. She was very thorough, and she did an absolute brilliant job, and I was just really proud of her. And then it was time for witness number 2 to come out. She did a brilliant job, and this was the one that had the hard time last time. There was no admin errors this time. She was asked questions on the story that she had, and she answered them very thoroughly. And then she went into cross-examination, and the guy was very respectful. But again, my witness answered the questions very well. So she was on stand probably 20, 30 minutes, I would hazard a guess. And she did a brilliant job, but it was very, very different to last time, because she was just answered questions on what she'd actually said and what she actually remembered. I could see the jury absorbing the detail and it sinking in, and this just felt so much more concrete. It felt so much more full of the information that I desperately wanted to come out in trial 1. So that pretty much came to the end of the day after witness number 2 had been examined and cross-examined on the things that we wanted her to be examined on this time, which is brilliant. Doesn't sound like there's a lot that happens in the day, but there's lots of waiting, there's lots of conversations, there's checking information between the barrister and the judges, or whatever the case may be. So although on that day there's actually only 2 witnesses that went on stand, we didn't even get out till about 3 o'clock or 3:30 or something like that, which kind of led us into day 3, where this is interesting because 2 of the other witnesses, one of them was the guy that had been dragged out of the gallery last time and thrown up on stand. This time he was expecting to go and stand, and he was told that he was no longer needed and they were going to take his statement and it was going to be used, which is what he got told last time. But this time he wasn't going on stand last minute. And the same thing happened to my mum, actually. She now became a witness in the second trial because of so many of the lies that this guy had said on the first one about my family and about my parents knowing about the relationship and how much time he spent with them. So both mum and dad offered to be a witness, and my mum had spent more time with him, so she was the obvious person. But she turned up on day three as well, expecting to go and stand, and she was also told that she was no longer needed. Now, there's pros and cons of this, obviously. It's a lot less stressful to not have to go and stand. But what this actually meant is that my mum and a friend of mine who was a witness had now missed day one and two, particularly for my mum, because obviously she'd want to be able to support her own daughter going up on stand and see the other witnesses. But she had to miss that and stay away until it was her day to go and stand, which she got told that she was no longer needed for anyway. So, but it meant that it was a lot less pressure for them. Their statements are going to be used, and admin wise, it was at least it was tight this time. So we were all there on the Wednesday morning. So by the time we'd done all the admin and the statements had been read out and the judges had done the things with the barristers and all lots of talking going on. So the only person that turned out to be actually examined and cross-examined on the day three was the police, which was later on, round about just after lunch, I think. She was asked questions about various things, but the barrister did a very clever job of her breaking down the arrest and what it means when you say anything you do say may be used as evidence in court, basically, because it was showing that he knew that everything he said in that interview was going to be used in this if it ever reached court, which it did, and now was effectively going to be used against him, as you say in the arrest warrant. But they also did the transcript thing again, but this time the barrister took the role of the guy we were prosecuting, and the police took her role as the person who interviewed him, which felt it was much more streamlined and so much easier to follow, because you had the police officer who actually had these questions said was now the one actually saying them on stand. So it was just so much easier to follow a female voice with a female voice, male voice with a male voice, the police playing the police role, and the barrister took the role of the guy we were prosecuting, which I think made a big impact to how it landed with the jury as well. And they both did a really good job on that. So at this point, I was feeling so much more settled, because if we were to lose this case, I could not walk out and say I hadn't had a fair trial on this one. So it was really good to see the way that this barrister was piecing it together and holding it together and managing this entire case, which basically led us to the final day of the trial, which was day 4 now. And this was for him to go on stand and answer all the questions that he was going to get from the barrister. The difference was with this one is that the barrister knew the detail and he had the evidence as well. So first of all, the evidence was enough to make this guy back down and admit that actually he'd been lying, but that couldn't be used against him just because he lied in the first court, because we had to abolish that court and it wasn't really relevant for this particular trial. However, he now couldn't use the same arguments that he wasn't at these places, or he didn't know these people, or these things that I now have picture evidence of that he said didn't happen, did happen. So it made it a lot harder for him. And the other beauty of this is that my barrister clearly knew the details. So whenever he said something that was a contradiction, my barrister said, but you just said this. And then the guy that we're prosecuting would put a lie upon a lie, but because my barrister knew the detail, he'd call him out on that lie. So, yeah, but you didn't say that, did you? You said this. And my barrister just basically exposed every bloody lie that he said. And I can't even tell you how that felt for somebody finally to hold this man accountable after all this time and after 6 years of him denying it and making a big deal about being the victim and taking no accountability whatsoever. It was just so relieving for somebody finally to hold this man down and not wriggle out with just an entire array of lies. So I can't say how long he was on stand. I'm going to guess around about 45 minutes to begin with. Then we had a break where we'd again just randomly walk past each other in the corridor, going to the toilet, going to the canteen, whatever the case was. We came back and then it carried on again. But this time, the tactics in which he used last time, my barrister didn't let him get away with, because he knew the detail. And on the occasions when he just tried to avoid answering the question, the judge had absolutely none of it. The judge actually stepped in a couple of times saying, can you answer the question? Can you answer the question? And then he said his name, can you answer the question? The judge was almost what I interpreted as getting frustrated as well. It was just worlds apart from my first trial. And my barrister had everything written down as well, and I could see him scrolling through his laptop and quoting him with some of these things. I could not have asked for a better barrister. After this man had been on stand, the judge did the same as what the judge did last time. He created a summary of everything that had been gathered from both sides of the argument and read it out to the jury. The judge releasing the jury round about 12 o'clock, and he said he was going to be available for another hour up until 1 o'clock if they were to decide upon a quick verdict. So when it came to the verdict, this is obviously the last day of the week. Now, my witnesses and any additional friends had to leave mid-morning kind of time. Unfortunately, my brother had to go back to work as well. So at that point, it was just left with me, my mum, dad, and the police. It got to 1 o'clock, nothing had come back to the judge. Everybody went away for the lunch at 1 o'clock, and the judge said he'd be back available again at 2 o'clock. By the time he came back at 2 o'clock, there was a note waiting for him to say a decision had been made. So at 2 o'clock, the usher got the note, and then we were all invited back in, and I was back in that room, sat down with my coat off by 2:15. The jury were brought back in. The judge asked if a decision had been made, and he said, do you find the defendant guilty or not guilty? But she said it so gently and so softly, I didn't hear if she'd said guilty or not guilty. So it could be easily be misheard if somebody speaks softly. I didn't want to have the experience of thinking it's guilty and then find out it was not guilty. But anyway, then the judge repeated it. You find the defendant guilty. And then my dad burst into tears on my right. Then my mum burst into tears on my left. And I burst into tears in the middle. And all three of us were just sat there sobbing. And then I turned around to the police and she was crying. So all four of us were just sat there crying. I get even emotionally triggered by it now, just thinking about it. It was such a big moment after so much build-up, after 2 court cases, after 3 rearranged court dates, after 6 years. I can't even tell you what was going through my head in that moment. I was just so grateful to the jury and the barrister because he really did an absolutely incredible job. I couldn't ask for any more really on this particular occasion. And I remember when the judge asked the jury to leave and he thanked them and gave them how important they were in this process, and he complimented them on their conduct in court. And he actually said, and I'm maybe paraphrasing, but he said something along the lines of the impact of you being here today is evident if you look at the response of the family, because all three of us were just sat there bawling our eyes out, basically. So when I walked out of court, the first thing I did is ring my sister and brother. So I was on a group call with them when I came out, and they burst straight into tears. So all three of us had a cry on the phone. I could feel my throat tightening up now, even just remembering it. So, and this is the part that people don't think about. All I remember is coming out of court and being around immediate family member, like phoning my sister and brother and being with my mum and dad. And it's like this overwhelm of, oh my God, it's over. It's done. He's been sentenced and it's over. You can't even explain that feeling of relief that it's come to this, but also it's over. The case is over. 6 years of finally I can be free of this thing. The police were emotional as well. It was a long old road, but we finally got here kind of thing. So it was overwhelming, to say the least. But obviously now we were expecting to do the sentencing and the victim impact statement, which often happen together. We'd been warned it was likely to be in December. Bearing in mind this was October. But the judge actually said he'll do it on the same day. And 45 minutes later, we're going back in for the victim impact statement and for the sentencing. This is a funny one because I'd fantasized about the concept of reading this thing that I'd spent hours on crafting together for this moment, and I never knew if I was ever going to get the opportunity to read it. So to actually be in this moment was quite overwhelming. When it came to the victim impact statement, something happened just as I was settled in my seat, just before the judge walked in. I really, really wanted it to be just like the verdict, just me, my mum and dad and the police, but somebody else just decided to walk in and contaminate this one moment that I was never going to have another opportunity for. And it just felt like they were there for the drama of it. But anyway, went up on stand. My dad came up with me in case I got emotional. But actually, my emotions were kept quite well contained. I'd spent a lot of time on it. But I had my moment to say it. And then the judge did the sentencing and basically decided on 6 years. There was other things I'm allowed to mention because it's in the documentation, but his reference to this man's assault charge against one of his previous partners was talked about. But if anything, that actually made his sentence smaller because he hadn't had any convictions since X date and however many years ago it was. And another thing I think it's worthy of knowing is that for a rape trial, the barrister explained to me that he wouldn't be able to get more than 7 years unless I'd been clinically diagnosed as depressed. And I probably was in that era, but at the same time, it was nothing official that was any documentation of it. It didn't go to any doctors or anything. So it was always going to be less than 7 years. So I've seen people online when the police posted this, that this guy had been sent down, people saying the judge was rubbish and he didn't give him long enough. Well, actually, the judge was excellent and his hands were tied with regulations of legislation of what they can and can't give him sentencing. And actually, the sentencing was quite high given the bandwidth that he was operating within. The judge actually did add on, I don't know how much, but I know that his sentence was elongated because of this person's behaviour in court. And he's mentioned at one point, you've done nothing but offer disdain towards me and my family since the beginning of the trial. And he didn't like that, especially since he told him to behave a few times. So the judge, I absolutely thought he's brilliant. Just before the sentencing, the judge actually read out like a summary of the whole thing. It took about 20 minutes of him talking. He had this incredible way to recite a summary of what happened between us. It was amazing the tone that he used that was so fueled with understanding, but really, really non-emotional. And some of the sentences he had to say would normally kind of make you squeamish and curl your toes, but it was the way he said it almost made it very, very matter of fact. It actually sounded quite, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't want to say normal. There was nothing normal about it. The only word that comes to mind is that it just sounded very experienced. Like he's handled a lot of cases in the past and he was just very, very good at his job. I can't even find the word. And this was the first time that I'd ever heard the story coming from somebody else in such detail and with such clarity. And I remember sitting there and just cried, thinking, holy crap, when you hear it from somebody else, when you hear the smaller detail, like lots of stuff I haven't even put in these videos, it really lands in a different way when it's being shared in the way that it was shared. And I was probably a bit overwhelmed at the time as well, with a 6-year fight finally coming to an end. So that was the end of the court case, basically. And the end of trial 2 came out. We had a good chat with a couple of the people that had been brilliant throughout the week and held everything together, like some CPS staff. Had a chat with the barrister. He was amazing. We thanked him about 1 billion times. So after the court hearing was over, my family and I started leaving the building. And somebody that was supporting the guy that we'd been prosecuting was at the front reception. We came down the steps, we were in the corners, like, here they are, here they all are, look at them, you're all going to burn in hell, karma's a wonderful thing, you're a stupid effing bitch, you're this, you're that. And I had a lot of abuse thrown at me. My parents had abuse thrown at them. The whole family were receiving this verbal abuse. Now, my priority at that point was just making sure that my parents were okay, given that they're in the very late 70s, not far off 80s. My mum was actually in a conversation now with the security guard, but I was walking down the steps behind my dad, just checking over my shoulder because I was in full body fight or flight. I didn't know if this was actually going to become physical because there was so much volatility being thrown at us. I'm not going to make excuses for this person, but I still stand with the concept that for a system, we shouldn't be exiting at the same point in the same way that we had to come in through the same door. Because for me, that is just an invitation for a massive car crash. When you've got 2 opposing teams and one person has just been sent to prison, is inevitably kind of asking for trouble, just in my personal opinion. So anyway, nonetheless, this is something that we had to face and battle through on the way out of court. Oh, hi. Sorry to interrupt this video with clearly an edited video from another day. I was just watching it back. I recorded that a couple of days ago and I just don't have the energy to record it all again and made a few attempts at it as well. So you have to just bear with this different ending and my crummy editing and my videography skills. But in summary, some people might question why I've made these videos around my trial. And first of all, not many people get to go on stand for something like this. And of the few that do, very few people talk about it. But I would say far less people have the experience of actually doing this twice and having such incredibly different experiences from trial number 1 and trial number 2. There's a few things that I just want to share in terms of like a mini summary. Firstly, for example, when it came to the judges, I thought both judges were exceptional. I was very lucky to get very good judges on both trials. I thought that they both operated from the highest level of integrity, the highest level of dignity. They both spoke to me with the utmost respect. They were both very warm, and it definitely put me at ease both times I got up and stand and had the small interaction with them. They both had very strict rules around what they found acceptable or not acceptable in terms of code of conduct and behaviour in their court. And that is completely down to the judge's discretion and it's very personal to them of what they choose. But I think it's fair to say there was some various parts of body language or body movements that I saw from the guy we were prosecuting that wasn't allowed in trial number two. For example, head shaking or arms coming out to the side. And whilst I was on stand, I personally found that quite off-putting and quite distracting. And I don't quite think I realised how much I appreciated trial two, and the judge categorically clamped that down. Now, I'm not in a position to say what's better or worse or right or wrong. I can only talk from my personal experience, but this meant a lot to me because it created, in my experience, a safer environment to talk freely, whilst I was already under a lot of pressure, talking about the most personal, intimate thing that's ever happened to me, to not be faced with the person that did it to me and that type of body language. So I was very, very grateful for judge number two. But it is a very personal choice, and I respect that from both judges. But both of them had very strict rules, and when anybody deviated away from that, they both were very stern in terms of what they expected in terms of code of conduct in their courts. When it came to the barristers, I don't know what the ins and outs of what happened before trial one and trial number two, but again, I can only talk from my personal experience. When I turned up and had a barrister that clearly knew the detail, I found that very reassuring just before I was going out to stand, because I knew that then the person we were prosecuting wasn't going to be able to get away with lies, etc. And I personally responded better to a more communicative barrister who spoke to me before the trial, during the trial, and at the end of each day, every day as the trial progressed. Whereas I didn't have a sit down conversation with barrister number one until the end of the trial. I personally just preferred working with a barrister who was more communicative and somebody that I knew that they knew the detail before we went out there. When it came to cross-examination, I didn't at any point feel that I was spoken to in a disrespectful way or anything like that. It's fair to say the strategy in which the cross-examination barristers took regarding how they were going to question me was very different. Trial number one, it felt that the questions were tailored to try and effectively sabotage my character. In trial number two, he absolutely stuck to the questions that were on point with what I'd said in my video interview, what I'd said on stand, what other people had said. They were very, very specific to the specific content, and they weren't asking me about random lies that happened 2 years after anyway. So both of them were respectful, but I preferred the approach because it felt more aligned to what we were there to uncover regarding the second trial. The judge, I remember, actually complimented barrister number two on the way that he'd handled this particular trial and the way that he'd gone about his own conduct, given the sensitivity of this topic. And I supported the compliments that the judge gave to him in that moment as well. When it came to actually going on stand itself, they were vastly different from a sense that the first one I got round about, I'm saying 20 just to be safe, but it felt probably closer to 15. And in the second one, I was on stand around about 45 minutes, and I was actually given the opportunity to talk about the parts that I felt that it was important that the jury got to hear. In both trials, I would say the guy we were prosecuting had about 2 hours on stand in the first one and about 2 hours on stand in the second one. And I didn't have a beef with how long he was on stand in the second one because I felt that I'd been given a good opportunity to share my voice, whereas I did have a beef with it in the first one because I didn't feel that I'd properly had the opportunity. Um, when it comes to the jury itself, that was vastly different as well. I would say jury number two was more diverse, and this is just luck of the draw. I believe it's just sent out on a machine and who is picked randomly. But it did turn out there were 6 men, 6 women, all different ages, all different ethnic backgrounds, different religions. So it was possibly the most diverse group of people I think I've ever seen. When it came to the building itself, it was a completely different structure. So the dock, for example, where the guy we're prosecuting sat within, in trial number two, they were sat behind the gallery, which meant that the only way you could see anything that was going on there is if you deliberately turned around and looked that direction. Whereas in trial number one, it was an old school courthouse, and it meant that the dock was in the middle of the room and the gallery was behind the dock, which therefore you were able to see all the behavior, which I found quite off-putting given that he spent a lot of time shaking his head or the body language that I was uncomfortable with. So again, that was a very different experience as well. I think the only thing really that I didn't prefer around trial number two as I did around trial number one is the general layout of the courthouse. So it means that there's no side doors as far as I'm aware. So we had to arrive at the same door, we had to leave at the same door. We were in the same courtroom, which meant that there's these long corridors, and you will spend several times a day walking past the person that abused you. You might pass them on the way to the toilet. You might sit two tables away from them in the canteen. And that was uncomfortable, but it kind of is what it is. And that also includes a gallery seating arrangement that you all sit together. So the people that are supporting the person that abused you are likely to be sat within a couple of meters of you. I don't think there's a great deal you can do with that, but obviously it's worthy of knowing that in advance just to be prepared for it. So I'm going to finish up with some things that I wish I'd have known in advance. I need to make it clear this is not advice. One, I'm not legally trained whatsoever, and I don't have enough experience in court, even though I've been there twice, to give advice. I'm just going to share some things that I wish I'd have known before going there to be prepared in case they were to happen. So the first thing is kind of obvious. If you're in a modern court, arrange it that you go at a different time than the person that you're prosecuting. It's very unsettling to potentially meet the person that abused you within 1 meter, which is what happened to me at the metal detectors hours before I went on stand in the second trial. I made the assumption because we went in a side door on the first trial, this is what would happen on the second one. I didn't think to check that. So it isn't what happened. And I was faced with them within 1 meter. So that was very unsettling. So again, now you know that there is an opportunity for you to rearrange it by simply arriving at a different time. If you're somebody like me that would feel more settled by speaking to your barrister before going on stand, then push for that to happen. I did request a couple of times to have a conversation with him, but he was in a meeting both times the police went. If I'd have known then what I know now, I would have probably pushed that a little bit more. I would have carried on asking until I had a meeting with him because I think a lot of things that were unsettling for me would have been resolved with a simple conversation because I kind of walked out on stand feeling the most uninformed person in the room. Of course, I knew my story inside and out, and I knew what I wanted to share, but I didn't know what to expect from anybody. I didn't know what to expect from the barristers, the judges, what type of things were going to be asked. But I found it a lot better to know in advance what type of things I was going to be asked for my barrister, at least. It may be that you arrive and your barrister is completely clued up or they've got some gaps in their knowledge. And I honestly think it's worthy of taking something with you of the key parts that you feel is important to be shared whilst you're on stand, because you know your story better than anybody. You also have to respect on the flip side of that, it's not technically your case anymore. It is effectively handed over to the CPS and you are their witness and they are the ones prosecuting. However, you know your story better than anybody. And if you know there are particular parts that are going to be more effective than others, then I think it's worthy of you sharing that with the barrister. So I actually took in my second trial, because of my experience in the first, a list of things that I wanted to make sure that the barrister was aware of. As it happens, he was. So it wasn't even necessarily needed, but I felt better for taking it with me. And if this is something that would upset you or destabilize you in the moment, then it might be something to consider if you're heading into court. If you do go on stand and you choose to spend the rest of the week with your family to support the whole trial, do be prepared that you are going to bump into the person that abused you multiple times a day, whether that be crossing in the corridor, whether that be on the way to the loo, maybe they're sat two tables away from you. And this also includes sitting in a close proximity with anybody that is supporting the person that did this to you in the same seating gallery. I don't think there's much you can do about it, but just being aware of it and prepared for it, it might help you if you're then in that situation. And finally, as and when you're leaving the trial, whether you get a guilty or a not guilty verdict, it's not a bad thing to make sure that you're escorted out with official people. So whether you go out with the police or maybe somebody goes down and checks the exit is clear first, or whatever the case may be. And it's fair to say it was a very uncomfortable moment for me and my family, especially after so much overwhelm, having spent 6 years in this whole process. That was the last thing that myself and my family needed at that moment. But I just think things can be avoided if you're aware of these things. So that's what I would have loved to have known before going in personally. So that's pretty much it. That's all I've got to share on both of my trials. If you've watched this far, then please don't forget to hit that like button, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comment box below. If you are somebody heading into court, then hopefully you found this useful or helpful in some way and give you at least a flavour of what to expect. But other than that, until next time.